hold on. Okay.
Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I'm your host, Stephen Falgout.
And I am your other host, Louis Falgu. Get Recc'd is our podcast where every episode,
Hello,
Steven and I
and
recommend
welcome
something
to
to
Get
each other.
Recc'd.
And I am hearing the stream going on twice. Why did that happen? Anyway, this is our podcast where at the end of every episode, Steven and I will recommend some piece of media to each other, be it an album, a TV show, a movie, whatever. And then in the next episode, we will get back together and discuss those recommendations. And today, we have got ourselves a themed rec. We've done a few of these. They are What Happened, which we'll explain in a sec, but we always do them at the start of the year because new year, new me. However, it's now 2020, and I'm kind of tired of this rugged individualist mindset. So frankly, this is not New Year, New Me. This is New Year, New Us.
Yes, and I just want to point out for everyone listening in the audience, you might have missed a little Easter egg there. You might have thought, oh, that sounds like a snafu that happened with the stream going up twice. No, actually, that was our Easter egg letting you know that this is the What Happened podcast because we were just like, what happened to the stream? So it was all intentional, all planned.
Yeah.
This episode is so good, it gets to be happening 2 times at the same time for your ears.
Yeah, and in fact, you can even extend that further. If you liked that effect, you can actually copy tabs in your browser, and you can have this stream running multiple times over. It'll be very interesting. And
Oh
I
my
feel
gosh,
like
and for
our,
some added benefit, for some reverb, if you want to open the stream on multiple browsers across different devices, then you can kind of get us in full surround sound.
Oh, and you can even turn some of them. Like YouTube has this option where you can change the speed of what you're viewing. I think if you're watching this live, you can't. But once this is up later, you can watch it multiple times on different speeds in each browser. It'll be really cool. I mean, we make such great points here that they really are worth repeating. They're worth hearing multiple times so that you can remember them. So.
And to that end, if you're listening to this on Castbox, just go ahead and rewind to the start of this and just listen to it over and over again.
Yeah, the first 5 seconds of the stream, preferably.
Yeah.
I mean, really, that tends to be the best. I feel like the first, 2 or 3 minutes of the stream is really the highlight.
Yeah, honestly, if we were to look at the stats, the analytics, I'm sure that most people just listen to the first 5 minutes and then skip to the very end of the podcast.
Yeah.
Because that's truly the meat of this thing.
Yeah.
Louis mentioned how we recommend stuff or whatever, but no, it's really about all the banter, and then all the middle is kind of like the extra fluff that you get on top.
Definitely. Well, Stephen, should we get into what you recommended to me last week or last 2 weeks, and also you can go ahead and explain your view of what happened to this?
Yes, Louis, I recommended to you the NBC television program The Office. The Office was a remake, a reimagining of the British version of the show, which was actually a short-lived miniseries in the UK and then was taken over to the States and created into long-form media. Louis, I recommended, and I don't remember if I said this or not in the last episode, but my take is that it went from good to bad. And I actually, in between the recordings, Louis, I gave you a specific set of episodes because just like, and honestly, this is very similar to the last recommendation that I gave you for what happened, only in the inverse, and in fact created by the same show creators. But with Parks and Rec, it started very slow and found its footing. The Office started slow in the first season, found its footing, and then crumbled completely once Steve Carell left the program in a very just absolutely abysmal fashion. Louis, I did not recommend to you, and for anyone listening at home, I did not recommend to you the last episode intentionally because I actually think that they did a very good job in the very final episode of The Office, actually ending The Office. But basically, for the listeners at home, Lewis, I recommended to you a smattering of episodes across the first X number of seasons while Steve Carell is there, and then a few episodes once Steve Carell leaves.
Okay, yeah. So, I, I mean, obviously, I'm alive, and I live in the U.S., so I'm aware of what The Office is. I mean, interestingly, this started in 2005, which seems earlier than I remember. But when I really think about it, I feel like this show's been around for as long as I've been alive, which it technically hasn't, but it might as well have been. And I never really watched it much, though. I mean, I was in a college class one time where the professor played the pilot, and I don't remember why. I think it was just because we were doing something else, and he just turned on The Office or something. I don't remember.
It's like those days where the substitute teacher comes in and puts on a movie.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, I mean, I knew what it was though, and now that I've watched it, yes, I now know what it is, even though I already did. Anyway, I don't know where I was going with that, but anyway, okay. So look, this is gonna be an interesting what happened here, because typically when we do these, I think the assumption's always been that both of us are pretty much going to have the exact same interpretation of events, and that, what the wrecker told us in the last episode happened to the show, and their view of it is pretty much going to be the same between the both of us. That's generally the assumption that happens. But I guess in true Get Recc'd fashion, that's not really the way it's supposed to happen, I guess. These episodes are supposed to be some kind of discussion or disagreement, if possible, wherever they come up. And I don't. I'm not saying I'm about to disagree strongly and throw some kind of bomb on you or something, because I'm really not. I guess it's just a matter of personal preference, because the style of humor that is in The Office, and really from beginning to end, from what I've seen, but mostly in the seasons that you are calling the good seasons here, is really where this is the case for the most part. I feel like it's really just like not for me. I found myself so the style of comedy that as I would describe it. I mean, first of all, we have to contextualize that the show is like a mockumentary, but it's like in the style of like a reality show. So in reality shows, you'll have the events going on, and then you'll pull individual people aside for interviews later, and you'll kind of intersperse them. And this show does that, although of course it's completely fake, as opposed to just mostly fake, I guess. And that going in. So you have this office space that is kind of dysfunctional, very awkward. The boss, Michael Scott, Steve Carell, right? Please tell me that's him. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
Steve Carell. I almost forgot his name, because there's somebody else who comes in later that I was getting him mixed up with. But anyway, and he's this sort of awkward boss who is trying to look cool a lot of the time. He's trying to get along with his employees. He's trying to keep the office, make it this really fun environment, but nobody's buying it. And so the way the reality show premise kind of goes along is that you're watching a cast of characters in this office who are all who are mostly anyway on the same wavelength about how awkward the situations are. And then you have Michael Scott and Dwight, I guess, as well, who are not. And that's basically the dynamic as I was able to pick it up from all the episodes that Steven told me to watch. And I am not going to say that this isn't well done, because this is definitely well done. I mean, for one thing, the presentation of this reality show format is extremely convincing. All of the actors play their roles like perfectly, at least all of them in these seasons here. I didn't feel like anybody was bad. I don't feel like anybody was like painfully unfunny, but like, when the humor is supposed to come from, I think, the awkward tension a lot of the time, or the failure of certain jokes to land kind of intentionally, I don't. I mean, it must just be a me thing, but I cannot vibe with stuff like that because I just get very uncomfortable, and I don't laugh when I'm uncomfortable. I think some people laugh when they're uncomfortable, or they just don't find this mega awkward and kind of painful. But I can't. I mean, and that really was how. Maybe not the later episodes, but definitely these, like, pretty much all went, and I just found it unpleasant.
Yeah, The Office is kind of the pinnacle of what I would definitely call cringe humor. And I guess contextualizing it, what came out in a time when that was pretty sparse. It was either that or Adult Swim was pushing that boundary to an exorbitant extent, and have only continued to do that with things like the Eric Andre show. But here, I think one thing that's interesting about The Office in general to me is as I've gone back and watched it after having watched Parks and Rec, I think that Parks and Rec was able to find an identity outside of that in a way that I feel like I ultimately have now come to enjoy more. Like after having watched fully Parks and Rec and coming back to The Office, I very much agree with you. That cringe humor at times is overwhelming. And especially, I don't remember if I gave you a lot of episodes in the first season,
You gave me
but
none.
especially in the first season. In the first season, there are episodes, and I think it's one of those things where it's also a sign of the times. It is, the boundaries are pushed so far to an extent that they're now unbelievable. The way that they handle race and sex, um, in a way that's very forcefully supposed to be cringe, is now so far outside of the zeitgeist that I don't even think you could create that show today anymore as it exists. With that being said, though, I think specifically what I want to talk about here, where I think this show really went downhill, is that Steve Carell was able to play that character, I feel like anyway, able to balance that line. And even if you can't get over that hurdle, his charisma and presence really allowed you to still be grounded in a reality. So Michael Scott's character, so Steve Carell's character, Rainn Wilson's character Dwight are offset by some of the more believable characters like John Krasinski's Jim and Pam and some of the other characters in the show. Once they took Michael Scott out of the picture, once Steve Carell left, and you have essentially a whole writer's room trying to figure out what to do to fill that void, it got cringy to a point where it was no longer charismatic, and also I felt like no longer even funny. So specifically what I want to talk about is like the difference between Steve Carell as Michael Scott and someone like James Spader's Robert California, whose character was so intentionally like grating that the show to me becomes literally unwatchable. Like I cannot watch the seasons without Steve Carell. With Steve Carell, even going back, it is hard now, but I can still watch it, and there are quite a good number of laughs to be had there. But once it gets past that point, it becomes so cringy and so unwatchable. And so I don't know, Lewis, I'm guessing you saw some episodes with Robert California, James Spader. I'm also guessing you saw some episodes where Andy becomes the boss, and essentially they try to inject more drama into the Pam and Jim relationship, which I felt was way overdone and unneeded.
I'm not sure what these, but oh yes, I did. Yes, okay. I watched like I think 3 or 4 from 8 and 9. So I probably, if they just like kept like rapidly changing boss figures and stuff, there's definitely some that I missed. But anyway, yeah. So I'm just trying to stay on topic and finish off with 1 to 7 here because just because I made 2 different cards for it. But like the I guess as points of comparison, I guess it's probably worth mentioning. Like, I think that one of the things I did appreciate about these seasons, though, is you mentioned like the race humor and stuff. But I feel like, to the show's credit, from what I saw, the joke was on the behalf of like the racist and not the other way around. And you only gave me a specific selection of episodes, so I have no idea how that translates across things. But for example, in the awards show episode where they're at Chili's, massive product placement, by the way. They had like a Chili's employee come out and give an interview about how this kind of thing doesn't happen at Chili's, which was something. But in this episode, Michael Scott does these like stereotype characters in front of everybody, but like you're not laughing because the stereotype is funny. The joke is that he is racist himself. Like he is the butt of the joke there, which is something I appreciate, because if you're going to tackle that kind of humor, that's basically what you have to do to be responsible. But anyway, it's just like, yeah, I mean, I guess you covered the basis. I don't know. I guess I just don't find.
So Lewis, specifically 1 through 7, I think I was very careful about selecting episodes that also, and this is another place where I feel like 1 through 7 does such a good job, where the rest of the seasons don't. I feel like I was very specific about picking out episodes that I felt like were the more heartfelt episodes that had real character development and character attachment. For instance, I'm thinking of Casino Night is a really big turning point in the show in general. And obviously the Pam and Jim relationship is like the kind of heart through line of the entire series, and that plays out there. But then also I wanted to be very specific about recommending you episodes where they humanize Michael. Because as much as he is the butt of the joke, he is trying, and they write that in what I think is a pretty spectacular way, honestly. Because, like I mentioned, it would be very easy to just continually make him the butt of the joke that he's not in on, and that is his character, but they also show elements of him that are much more grounded. So, for instance, I believe I at least tried to recommend you the episode where he goes to Pam's art show when no one else shows up.
Yeah.
I think that's a very important episode for Michael Scott. I also think I recommended you an episode with Holly, which is kind of his foil. And again, is just showing that human element of that character. And they do that really well throughout 1 through 7 for all of the characters. Pretty much top to bottom. They are very specific about making sure that you know that these are real people.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough for me because, I mean, to critically discuss the show, it's hard for me to point out things I think aren't good. I just don't like it. Like, I don't like Michael Scott as a character. I don't like this dynamic. I don't like this humor dynamic. All I can give you is statements like, I don't like this, I don't like that, for the most part anyway. Because when I try to think of things that I thought were actually bad... Well, I guess there was one episode you gave me where they go to infiltrate a small family business, and I thought this episode was like actual crap. In fact, of all the episodes I watched, I thought this was the worst. And that includes the stuff I watched in 8 and 9, which plays into, I guess, what I was going to say later. But, this was probably the first time where I felt like the reality show format was really bad. Was actually not working. There was a really strong disconnect because they had to work around the limitations of like having a camera crew while Michael and Dwight are going into this family business. So they had to like stand outside of the building the whole time, filming through the windows with like really bad framing. And a lot of times when you have limitations like this to work with, you can be creative and do interesting things. But here it was just like, it just felt like a hindrance. And then a lot of these episodes kind of do an A-plot, B-plot sort of thing. I guess that's natural. And the B-plot of this episode was everybody saying whether they thought Hilary Swank was hot or not. And it was horrendously unfunny. So anyway, okay, so there's my actual things I thought were bad. But, like, other than that, I feel like if this is something that could be funny to you, then this is definitely, like, one of the better, like, or I would assume this is a good direction for this kind of humor. It's done well, and like you said, yes, it is actually grounded, which is something I agree changes in the end. In the like the last two seasons, like despite the fact that a lot of these situations are maybe just too dumb to be real, and characters can seem kind of unbelievable. There is like a strong human element there still. That there's still some core of heart where you actually like people. And that's probably essential. I couldn't see a setup like this working in a kind of comedy where you're supposed to like hate everyone, because I think you have to naturally grow attached to these characters to some extent for any of this to even like come across as funny. And then of course you have the like will they won't they kind of thing between Jim and Pam. But it to me it seemed like it's just like the thing you do, I guess. It wasn't really like interesting. It was just like, okay, so you have the will they won't they thing, so people keep coming back, and well, I guess Twitter wasn't around. Anyway, you get fan engagement. It just didn't seem special to me, but I mean I see why it would to somebody else. But anyway, have we discussed those seasons enough? Should I switch the card? Should we
Yeah, that one I think is also very specific because that one is definitely a sign of the time. Like, to that point, sitcoms were really not structured like The Office. They're pretty much sitcoms where every episode is a very unique, distinct entity, and there weren't really like season long or even across season narrative for sitcoms. It was really literally a situational comedy, and you would have characters that would like get together and come apart and those sorts of things. But the way that The Office is formatted and structured was really kind of very unique for the time and has now been replicated throughout every comedy ever. So the Jim Pam thing was honestly kind of a very new entity, honestly.
Okay. Do we want to get to the bad, as it were, as it's called?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So here, Steven didn't actually tell me specifically which episodes to watch, so we may not end up on the same page, and it's just because I might not have seen some of the stuff that he's talking about. But what I gathered, I probably should mention real quick, for the latter seasons, he gave me the final episode with Michael Scott, which was definitely my favorite that I watched. I mean, I wouldn't say I loved it, but when you talk about like the heart and the character of the show, that was a lot more present in that episode. I mean, it was basically the episode that everyone's supposed to watch and cry and talk about how sad it was. And it didn't make me cry. It didn't make me sad, but that's just because I guess I haven't watched a lot of this or had any connection to it. But, it was effectively done to the point where even without that connection, I was able to enjoy that episode. I thought they did a lot of good things there. So as a, like a goodbye to him, it was effective. And then you move into this, where what Steven said about the show, like no longer knowing how to structure itself, like trying to find a way to continue without his dynamic anymore, and how bad that turned out. I didn't. It must just be because I didn't see what was. I didn't see much in the show prior to this, but like, to me, the one thing I would say that this is definitely worse off for is the fact that that dynamic is lost, and the character dynamics are kind of weird now. You had to play up like Dwight. I noticed they really played him up, in these seasons, and also just the character dynamics that they had outside of Michael Scott weren't really that strong, aside from like Jim and Pam. But the way that they play off each other comedically, it seemed to be a lot better off with Michael Scott there than without him, because again, here people sort of become stereotypes of themselves, and so that was probably my biggest pet problem that I had with this. But honestly, I didn't find it that much worse than what I saw before. And I mean, I admit that's probably just because I didn't like it prior to that anyway, but I didn't find this awful. And maybe I watched the better episodes, I don't know. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I've kind of spoken my piece on this a little bit, but yeah, I agree with you for sure. Most of the characters become stereotypes in themselves. There's this void that they try to fill, and they don't do a very good job of it. James Spader's character is insufferable. And I don't remember how long he lasts, but honestly, he shouldn't have lasted as long as he even did. And then they basically prop Andy Bernard, who essentially was a throwaway character, honestly. To give a little backstory, Andy Bernard's character was a throwaway character, a character that they just kind of came up in the writer's room and said they're going to basically create a new foil to Jim, but make him, whereas Dwight is kind of this uber nerd who rolls with the punches. Andy was basically a character that had so many anger issues that he punches a wall, and that was going to be the end of his character. But they liked him so much that they actually had him go to anger management and come back. And honestly, that decision was made like in that week. So that character wasn't even supposed to be there. Now, I think Andy Bernard and the actor that portrays Andy Bernard do a fabulous job, actually. Once that whole arc kind of happens and he comes back, that character really takes on a life of its own. But with that being said, they prop Andy Bernard up as the new boss, and that becomes a whole ordeal.
That was
then
actually,
in the final.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can I jump in there, because that was the boss that I pretty much saw. I think in every episode he was the main boss. The James Spader person, right? I saw him in an episode, but he was with another company. So I'm not sure what I missed. But anyway,
yeah, he was the boss for a while, and it was insufferable. Also, Will Ferrell was there for a couple episodes.
Yeah, I saw Will Ferrell in one episode, and I don't like his style of humor ever, so I didn't like that. But anyway, I just wanted to say the Andy Bernard character, I don't even know what he is. Like, unlike Michael Scott, who like I could hammer down and like see exactly how he played into the group dynamic, who he was supposed to be. This guy's just like a guy. I didn't get anything out of him in these episodes as the boss. He was really boring, like profoundly boring. Not funny at all. It was hard to tell if he was even trying to be. And if he was, from what angle, I don't know. But that's why I made sure to say that, despite the fact that I didn't find this to be too much worse. If I have one main problem, it is the changing of the guard there with the boss, because like I don't even know how this guy was supposed to lead the cast in any way.
And then the last thing, and I think I mentioned it in the final episode, in the final season, they try to re-inject some drama into the narrative, and especially into the narrative between Jim and Pam, in a way that I found to be pointless, not needed. It really didn't accomplish anything. Didn't develop the characters any more than they already were. It was the final season anyway. It just seemed like an odd choice and something that stuck around for too long as well. Lewis, I don't know if you saw any of that stuff, but basically in the last season, there's some drama about if somebody's like their marriage is kind of falling apart, and Pam might be having an affair with the cameraman or something. It just got so overbearing in a way that was just so odd. They not only did the writers feel they lost their comedic identity once Michael Scott had left, that kind of through line, but I feel like they also lost the heart of the show as well, that through line. So once both of those things collectively collapse, the show really becomes nothing, honestly. And it wasn't until the very, very final episode that I feel like they even stood any ground once Michael Scott had left, or Steve Carell had left.
Okay, well, I'm about ready to wrap up if you are.
Yep.
Yeah, okay, so, I mean, look, I don't even feel the need to split the show into two halves. If I had to like score the whole thing, I guess it'd be like a 5 overall, because that's just how I felt. I mean, it wasn't like it wasn't bad. I said it was kind of unpleasant to watch, and I mean it was, but at least it was well done for part of it. But I don't know. I totally see why other people like this. It's literally just a case of this is not for me, and I don't normally admit that. So I guess that gives props to The Office in that sense. But if we're talking about what happened to the show, I mean, we kind of went over it. But yeah, I do think that like having Steve Carell's character leave is pretty much kind of just tears whatever cohesion there was to shreds, and does leave you with this kind of blank, empty, just meaningless blob at that point, where all the characters, I mean, they're still themselves, but they kind of just have to amp them up to find any comedic value out of them. I didn't think it was unfunny necessarily, at least if it was, in the same way I found the rest of it unfunny, which is like it wasn't painful, but it's just like yeah, it lost an identity. So I can agree with that, even if I probably wouldn't think of it as extreme as Steven probably does.
For me, I would split the two halves. The earlier seasons, 1 through 7, I'd rank probably at an 8. And the latter seasons are literally unwatchable to me, so I don't know if that means I'd put them at a 1 or what I'd put them at, but honestly, they should have ended the show when Steve Carell decided to exit. I think that they tried to keep it alive and it needed to be resuscitated at that point anyway, and it didn't work.
I mean, it would have been a cool finale too, honestly. That episode, whatever it was called, the one where he leaves, would have been a good finale, I think. So it's odd that, and it wasn't even the finale of the season, if I remember. I think there were still like 2 more episodes in that season.
Yeah, there were.
Which is weird, but anyway, okay. So should we move on to what I recommended to you, Steven?
Yes.
All right. So I recommended to Steven progressive rock band turned pop rock band Genesis. I gave him 2 albums, Foxtrot from 1972, when they were a progressive rock band consisting of Peter Gabriel as the vocalist, Phil Collins as the drummer, Steve Hackett, guitarist, Tony Banks, the keyboardist, and Mike Rutherford, the bassist. And then post this point, when Peter Gabriel left 2 albums later, they got whittled down, eventually anyway, to Phil Collins as the vocalist, Tony Banks as the keyboardist, and Mike Rutherford on bass and also guitar. And this is the lineup, this trio is the lineup that carried them throughout the 80s, the lineup that most people probably know because they had a lot of big hits in the 80s, and they were a very, very successful rock band at the time. And then I didn't recommend Steven any albums from this particular era because I assumed he would have been familiar with this era of the band enough already. So I skipped to their final album that the band released in 1997, Calling All Stations, when even Phil Collins had left, and it was just Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford of the original members picked up singer Ray Wilson to try to reinvigorate the band, which obviously didn't work because they never made an album after that. And with that, I will let Steven... Well, oh, and I guess I should be specific. I argued that they went from being good to bad, or I suppose in this case, excellent to terrible. So anyway, take it away. Oh, with Foxtrot, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, so this is an interesting one for me because I want to talk about generalities because it's so apparent to me, and I'll talk about Foxtrot specifically, but just to again talk about generalities, it's so apparent to me how different the sound and identity of this band became from album 1 to the final album. And you can feel that progression without even understanding that progression. Because Foxtrot is so dynamically different than what Calling All Stations is that it almost doesn't even feel like it's the same band anymore. And honestly, I would argue maybe it isn't, because at what point do so many members leave that you probably should just call yourself something else? But starting with Foxtrot, this is an interesting one to look at, especially compared to the last prog rock album, because this one is very good.
I would
this one is very, very
Calling
good.
All Stations prog rock, but yeah.
No, I'm talking about the last prog rock album we talked about on the show.
Oh, excuse me, Steven. You mean progressive metal. I'm sorry, I will not allow you to get away with this misclassification.
I
anyway, wasn't the last prog rock album we talked about animals? I think so. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Whatever, keep going, I'm sorry.
So this is a low track album, but a lot of the tracks have a pretty long listing. In fact, one of them is like pretty much the entire length of the album. I just really like what is going on here from all levels, from sound to the track listing and the track progression. And honestly, I think I kind of just want to talk about Supper's Ready, because
That's
that
fine.
it's like there's so much to unpack there. Now, I mean, it is like most of the runtime, so it makes sense that there's a lot to unpack there. But I'm looking at, like, for instance, the Wikipedia page, and they even specifically have denoted Supper's Ready into different
Yeah,
subsections,
7
which
movements, yeah.
which I definitely can understand because they are very distinct movements, and each of them is just so good. First of all, Peter Gabriel's vocals, just in general, I really like a lot. I know we've talked about Gabriel before in his solo career, but here as well, where his solo career very much gets more pop rock, this he's allowed to kind of play with his range, and then also lyrically, there's a lot more interesting dynamic here, so that's definitely a component of it. And that's, I think, really highlighted in Supper's Ready, because each of these different acts is very different, very organically different, very vocally different. Collins really shines. Gabriel really shines. Collins really shines. That's what I wanted to say too. I think the drums here, backup vocals here, very good by Collins. I mean, you can really see what the identity of this band is, and because I want to specifically call this out because obviously this identity leaves once we get to the next one. But Collins and Gabriel, this power dynamic, this power duo, are just absolutely killer on this album. And not to discredit anyone else in the band, especially Hackett. Some of the guitar riffs, some of the guitar transitions throughout this album, top to bottom, are really spectacular. And Supper's Ready as well. Able to, the asyncopated nature, or the syncopated nature of, like, some of the stuff going on here as well between Collins and Hackett.
And don't
I
forget
really
that.
like.
Don't forget Tony Banks on the keyboards here, just shredding the keys.
Oh yeah, I know.
Well, something interesting about Genesis in the classic prog canon is that out of a lot of the major bands, they might have been the most keyboard driven, because really, and this I guess is true throughout almost their entire career, even a lot of their pop rock stuff. That in Genesis's music, it's, as opposed to most rock music and even prog, the primary instrument is not the guitar. It is definitely the keyboards. Like the keyboards, the synths, and the mellotron on this album really drive these songs. Which is not to say that every other instrument doesn't play its part. And of course, guitar and bass and drums and everything. Of course, it all like matters a ton. But where there are main melodies, even riffs, and melodic ideas, it's pretty much all placed on the keyboards throughout most of this record, and most of their discography, really. But even during this prog era, a lot of these albums were very focused on the keys. Another thing that I think needs to be mentioned, and it has to do with Peter Gabriel, because obviously Peter Gabriel leaves after this, before the band reaches massive success, and he is not on the other album that we're going to talk about as well. He brought like a level of theatricality, charisma, and eccentricity to Genesis that, like, I don't think any other prog band had. I mean, like, there are other ones who, of course, were theatrical. I guess that was the whole thing behind prog back in these days, and I guess even now. And obviously that was there, but like Gabriel was just something else. And when you do compare him to what we talked about on with So, which was his 1980s big hit pop album, like he really toned it back once he got around to that time. Because like when you're listening to him here, he is just all over the place. He's so wacky. He's so goofy. There's such a sense of humor, and also this kind of biting British wit, like on Get Him Out by Friday, which is about the process of winkling, which I researched before I did my retrospective on this band, but I kind of forgot. It has something to do with like raising the rent on tenants so that they leave, but I don't remember why people did that. I used to know. Doesn't matter. Anyway, he's able to, on this song, like play different characters and change his voice depending on which character he's playing, which is something he did in a lot of these albums. And so, I think the one thing, if you can say about their entire prog era, of course we're just talking about this album, but if you can say about their entire prog era is that they just had so much character. And I'm sure just from listening to this one album, you could tell.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention actually the label that this released on is Charisma Records, and I was going to specifically mention that that fits so well.
Yeah, it's true. So much charisma.
Yeah, I'm looking at a picture of Peter Gabriel when they took this on tour, and he's wearing like an Egyptian headdress, black eye makeup.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's another thing that we have to actually mention. I probably would have forgotten to. Rock show concert theatricality is a big thing and has been for decades, but Genesis were one of the first bands, along with an artist like David Bowie, to make that a thing. Genesis were famous in their live shows for Peter Gabriel's outfits, their stage setups. He would change costumes constantly throughout a show. And he would do his Supper's Ready performance. There's actually a live video of Supper's Ready from around this time that I highly recommend watching, because throughout that song he changes costumes I think 4 times in the process of the performance, which was just something that he did.
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely see there's plenty of time for him to be able to do that.
Oh yeah.
With the runtime of these. Yeah, the other thing I'm looking at is just the sheer musicality of each of the members of the band at this point. I mean, Tony Banks is obviously on keyboard, guitar, organ, but then you have things like Gabriel played the flute, the tambourine, and the oboe. Michael Rutherford played the cello here. Like, that's just incredible.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, everybody in this band were incredible musicians, and continued to be, by the way. I mean, Colin stepped away from the kit after a certain point. He still drummed in the studio albums, but in terms of like the kind of drumming he was doing on this stuff, you do not hear that once you enter like Genesis's pop era at all. It is insane. And on the next album, which is usually hailed as their essential masterpiece release, Selling England by the Pound, another incredible album, like, the musicality of this band, if you thought it was amazing on this album, and it is, on that album, it is like on a whole nother level. It's insane how tight and just brilliantly and brightly they play. And also how melodic as well. Like, that's another thing about Genesis is I think a lot of people call their music very flowery, which is definitely true. It's super melodic. It's super like bright. And even though there's definitely there's an experimental edge to what they were doing, as with all these prog bands, it's not like anything they did was abrasive or really dissonant or amelodic. They were always like just super bright and cheery, at least when they wanted to be. But one thing I want to say about Foxtrot, because Foxtrot is my favorite album by Genesis, I think it's their best, is like, I mean, first of all, yeah, every single song here is just incredible. The flow of this album is brilliant. And I mean, from the opener, Watcher of the Skies is just one of the most captivating openers in all of prog. It's just like, it catches your attention right off the bat with that crazy rhythm and like how huge that song sounds. And then all the way until, of course, the finale, A Supper's Ready, which is my favorite song of all time, hands down. That song is unbelievable. Like, not only, I mean, every movement being amazing on their own, yes, of course, but like so many chilling and haunting moments throughout that thing, so many incredible changes of tone, where the tone of 2 movements contrasting each other ends up enhancing each other as well, until you get to the final like 2 movements of this thing, which are just immense and like powerfully like spiritual and transcendent. It's unbelievable. Like, and I just find it funny listening to Supper's Ready and then like thinking about like later Genesis. It's kind of crazy. It's very crazy. Even me knowing their entire discography and knowing how they transitioned from album to album, it's still crazy, the turns that they took.
Yeah, I think for me that was my biggest takeaway in general. Not even having listened to Calling All Stations, but just knowing more of their pop rock era hits. Coming to this is just like something so radically different. all of it is just so radically different. Such a different sound, such a different oeuvre that it's like it's hard to believe, even because, as you mentioned, we listen to Peter Gabriel stuff and he doesn't even take what's happening here into his solo career. His solo career just kind of gets defined by just pop rock. And I mean, Collins as well, eventually the same thing. So where this album and the next album come from, I really don't know.
And I think we may, well, since we're talking about each album individually, it might be worth to wrap up each one first. So, what are your overall thoughts of Foxtrot, assuming you were done otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, this album is impeccable. I enjoyed this album all the way through. I don't know if I have any major complaints or even any minor complaints at all, honestly. Um, so I'll just say that, and we can score at the end and move on to calling all
Oh,
stations.
sure. Okay, we'll do the scores. Okay, great. All right. Well, wow. Look at that album cover, everyone. Just holy fuck. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway,
What? Okay. So what's interesting about this is, first of all, I already mentioned this is very different than Foxtrot. That's very apparent, but I don't think this is trying to be that. So I want to even think about this album in the context of what came before it in that middle period, because I think that middle period was they had so much popularity there with Collins at the helm. Once they get into the 80s and become, really a big rock band, that this album absolutely feels like them trying to emulate that success. And I would say specifically track one, two, I would say four. It's very clearly Calling All Stations, Congo, and Shipwrecked all sound like they're trying to be some of their bigger hits from that 80s era. And then once you get past that, it just becomes so monotone and like weirdly early 90s power ballad, like slow, like oh my god, she left me, I'm so sad kind of songs over and over. It's just so monotonous. There's really nothing interesting musically going on, both from vocals and from instrumentation. I mean, I would even argue in the first four albums, Congo was probably their biggest success off this album, and I just don't find it very enjoyable. It's just kind of drab. What's interesting to me is, even to put this in the context of like 97, it's not even doing 97 charts right.
oh,
It's like this weird, like trying to emulate that 80s sound, bring it into the 90s, try to make it a little edgier, but nothing here. It's all so synthetic. It's also hyper productioned, hyper productionalized, that it's like you can't even, I don't even find it enjoyable.
it's so good you bring that up, because one of the funniest things about Calling All Stations to me, just like conceptually, is like when you look at this on our screen here, Genesis Calling All Stations, and then you see 1997 in parentheses. I mean, for one thing, the fact that Genesis was releasing an album in 1997 is already funny, but when you hear this album, it is really like, it's one of those things where you just have to sit back and think, and I don't normally even make this a consideration when I think about an album, but when I heard Calling All Stations, it's like, who are they even making this album for? Like, what audience is going to enjoy this? Like, because I can guarantee you pop rock listener, or pop rock, well, yeah, sure, pop listeners in 97 didn't want this. Pop listeners in the 80s wouldn't have wanted this. Pop listeners in the 2000s would not have. Like, you think about the sounds that were trendy at this time, both in rock and in pop, and this album doesn't hit on either of them. So if this was some kind of attempt to, make a successful album, it is just a massive failure. And it's kind of appallingly so as well. But, like, then you could say, okay, so maybe they're making it for Genesis fans. But, like, what about this is going to appeal to Genesis fans of any era? And, not just, like, prog fans, because they were well off this boat by now. But, like, even their pop listeners from the 80s, like, what does this album offer you? And I say that about an album that's over an hour long. This is a long album. And, like, it doesn't give you anything. It's just one of the most, like, baffling releases I've ever heard, because at least with other failures from major bands, you can at least kind of see where it came from. Calling All Stations is just fucking weird. It's just like, why did they do this?
Yeah, and I like that you point out the length, because where Foxtrot is also pretty lengthy.
Yeah, like 50.
And a lot of the tracks are 7+ minutes long. You never feel it. Calling All Stations, boy, do you feel it. And this is such a minor complaint, but I don't know why it bugged me so much. But there are so many seconds of fade out on every single one of these tracks.
Yeah, oh my god, I noticed that my first listen too. Like, they fade out in the middle of a verse sometimes. Like,
yeah, and it's like, I timed one of them, and it was like 15 seconds of the track runtime was fade out. And I was like, what are you doing? That really got me. Like, I was like, what is even happening here? Why? What's the point? So, yeah, I think I mentioned it. Really, to me, the only tracks here that even have any credence are the first few, and those I don't even find to be enjoyable. Once you get past, like, Shipwrecked, it just all became such this monotonous blur of weird, really slow, not very melodically interesting power ballad. I think what's interesting to me is that Wikipedia calls this album art rock, and I guess, is this art?
That cover art, that is art. Okay. No, actually, just to point it out, I do think that there are tracks here where you can tell the band is trying to make, like, some kind of appeal to prog. Like, I forget the name of one of the songs. There's like a almost 8-minute song on here, like a 7+ minute song or something towards the middle. What the fuck is it called? I don't remember. But, like, you can tell it's, like, kind of got that prog sensibility about it, like a lot of, like, keyboard solos and stuff. But unlike, good prog, but even unlike, like, Genesis prog from the 70s and such, like, there is, like, absolutely nothing to it. It's just so banal. It's just, like, really, really boring and stale noodling at best. More along the lines of Dream Theater, to recall them, than Genesis. But even then, like, it's just such a flop whenever they attempt something like that. And if they're not doing that, then you're getting, like, slow power ballads. And can we also mention Ray Wilson? Like, I think, honestly, one of the main reasons Genesis might have failed with this album and truly just called it quits, is because Ray Wilson is just a bad replacement for, not only Peter Gabriel, definitely for Peter Gabriel, but even for Phil Collins. Like, Ray Wilson is just not a very good vocalist. He sounds like he's like a post-grunge singer, which tells me that there was an attempt to try to, like, stick with the times. He's got that, like, gruff, like, I was inspired by Nirvana kind of thing going on, but, like, he's singing songs that probably belong more in the 80s. It's very weird.
And I think that's one of the other reasons why I feel like you can definitely tell they're trying to emulate that sound, because in the first couple of tracks, you can obviously tell he's trying to emulate Phil Collins. In one of the tracks specifically, like, they even have that same kind of intonation, rhythmic flow, but it just doesn't work. It doesn't even work for his voice.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like the kind of music he should be singing on regardless. He's just a really weird replacement in every single way. And you do have to figure, like, once Phil Collins leaves, like, isn't it just time to say we're done? Like, You have two members of this band left. You're not going to get Gabriel back. You're not going to get Collins back. Like, finding a new singer just seems like such a bad idea. Like, you could say, yes, it worked when they transitioned from Gabriel to Collins, but Collins already had some songs that he had sung solo prior to that. Like, there's one on Selling Only by the Pound, there's one on Nursery Crime, which is before Foxtrot, and of course he did backup voice, and plus he was a member of the band. Like, he was very, very familiar with the way that they worked together. Getting a new guy is just a really weird choice. You know, as if like Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford were the members that people, like, that audiences were really fixated on, you know? Like, they definitely weren't, even though they were definitely talented and pulled a lot of great stuff before. So it is just strange. I mean, I think if there's one thing that is worth saying about this album more than anything else, is that this is just a weird-ass album. This is like a weird anomaly from a bygone era that came out way later than an album like this ever should have, from a band that made Selling England by the Pound and The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway and, you know, Foxtrot, and even the band that made, like, Invisible Touch. It's just strange.
Yeah, I think I'm good to wrap it up.
Okay, when you do that, I would ask that you, at least, like, or for the answer to the question, since I didn't recommend you anything from the '80s era because I figured you were familiar with it, but I feel like you should probably pay lip service and mention that, and your familiarity with it or whatever.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I'm quite familiar with their '80s work. I've listened to, I'm at least familiar with all of the charting singles. I've listened to, I believe, a couple albums from that time era, basically the Collins era. I'm probably more familiar with the Collins era than the Gabriel era. With that being said, I do definitely agree with you that this went from good to bad in a marked degree. With that being said, I think I would give Foxtrot, honestly, I'd probably be willing to give Foxtrot a 10. It is just an impeccable album from start to finish. Calling All Stations, I think I'll be nice and give it a 2.
I'll be nice and give it a 2.
I'll be nice and give it a 2.
Oh man, poor Ray Wilson, man. Damn.
Because I heard Congo and I was like, oh yeah, I remember this song, and that made me a little bit nostalgic. So I give that one a 2.
Okay.
So that's an 8-point difference between the two.
Yeah. Well, I guess it is also 2 decades apart though, but it's still pretty crazy. Yeah, I mean, I already did a retrospective on the band, so I actually have covered what happened, I guess. But to sum it up, I mean, yeah, like, look, a lot of most prog bands didn't know what the hell to do when the 80s came around, because the sound that they had furthered, the experiment that they all went on collectively no longer held any weight. As the 80s were coming on, it was really punk bands and new wave bands that had pushed new sounds forward, and those sounds were not anything like what the prog bands were doing before. And so they all had to learn to adjust. I mean, they all did it. Yes did it. Even Pink Floyd did it. King Crimson even kind of dabbled in that. I mean, like, all these bands, they had to do something, right? Rush even. And so, but Genesis really went like the extra mile. I mean, to me, 80s pop Collins-led Genesis post Duke, because Duke's a very good album. Post that, like, they really did just make some of the lamest music, some of the most blasé music that I can think of. But you can at least say that as a pop band, they got success. They were successful for their time. They were able to adapt to the changing times pretty quickly, actually, quicker than other prog bands were, and they found success doing it. When even that just crumbles, like on this album, it becomes far worse, because now you can't even give it credit for that. Like, this is just an album that I would assume every band member probably would like to forget and pretend never happened. fans would like to pretend never happened. The music world in general should probably pretend this album never happened, because it's just strange, confusing, and awful. It is awful. Like, this album is awful. Okay, when you get Steven saying I'm gonna be nice and give this a 2, that should tell you. Okay, this album is awful. There is almost nothing redeemable about this record, and like, and again, it wasn't even a success for them. It's just confusing and awful. So, as a summary, yes, I give Foxtrot a 10. It's one of my all-time favorite albums, one of the best albums ever made, one of the best prog albums, just a delightful, incredible, creative, and adventurous album to come out of the prog era, one of the most in all of those categories. But then, of course, their entire prog era makes Genesis one of my all-time favorite bands easily. I mean, when you talk about, like, Nursery Crime, of course, Selling by the Pound, and Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. I mean, these are just amazing albums with legacies that will transcend time, right? But, like, Calling All Stations is not even a product of the time. It's just there. It's like, why did this happen? And I would also give it a 2. I can't justify a 1 because I don't think this album is, like, offensive to my senses. But it does make me want to fall asleep, so I don't know if that's more negative. I don't know. But anyway. So yeah. I guess we could say what happened is that, and you'll probably agree with this, is that Genesis no longer knew how to adapt with the times.
Yeah, and I think we can say what happened to The Office was that Steve Carell left, and they wanted to keep making a television show.
Hey, and here Phil Collins left, and they wanted to keep making albums. Hey, isn't that a coincidence? Anyway. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it. Do you think so? We should go to Recs?
Yes.
All right, well, Steven, you go ahead and recommend something to me. There's no theme next time. Just, regular old rec.
Okay, Lewis. So I am going to recommend you something in a category that I feel like we're still lacking a little bit, only because it's kind of hard to recommend things from this category, but I'm going to recommend to you a video game. And that game is Bastion. Bastion is an indie game from 2011. It was kind of one of the big indie games out of that very first, or I would say maybe the second Genesis indie movement. Developed by Supergiant Games and published by Warner Brothers. You can pretty much get it on all platforms these days, so it shouldn't be hard to find. Supergiant went on to develop a couple other games. This was their first foray, so I'd like to kind of start here as we talk about their entire game library.
Okay, fantastic. And Steven, I'm going to be recommending to you an album by 100 Gecs. The album is called 1000 Gecs. 100 Gecs is a, how do I define them? Like, bubblegum bass, nightcore inspired, experimental pop. I'll just say that. That's not really a genre tag, but I can't think of a better way to describe them because they do. I mean, there's just so many things going on there. I'll just say that. Bubblegum bass, as a point of reference, I recommended you the Sophie album Oil of Every Pearls and Insides. That was like a year or two ago, but that's the same genre. I don't know how comfortable I feel using that label for this album, so whatever, it doesn't matter. What else do I say about this? I mean, this album hit it pretty big last year, and 100 Gecs probably have a lot ahead of them at this point. They're definitely on the up and coming duo, Dylan Brady and Laura Les. And I think that's all I have to say about that. So, okay. That does it for our epic What Happened. This is an epic What Happened, okay? Let's be clear. Okay? We talked about The Office and Genesis. Could you even get more large scale than that? I don't think so. Do we have anything to say? I mean, I do.
I don't think I have anything.
I put out a music video yesterday, so you can watch that, I guess. If you're on CastBox, I don't know how you find my channel. I don't even link it, I don't think. So, don't worry about it, I guess. But if you're not, then have fun with that. Other than that, though, yeah, I think that pretty much is it. We are in Castbox. Link in the description. Check us out. You can listen to us in the car, at work, at school. I mean, I don't know. You can listen to us anywhere, which is pretty exciting. So,
In a plane, on a train, in a house with a mouse.
Yeah, probably not with a mouse. That'd be kind of weird. But I guess you could. I don't know. I don't think the mouse would get much out of it, probably. But what do we know? Who knows? Get Recc'd. Mouse approved.
Yeah, mice are really big fans of Calling All Stations, so they might not have liked this specific episode.
We really pissed off all the Calling All Stations fans today.
Our mouse audience.
We have some hot takes on Get Recc'd sometimes, But anyway, I think that's pretty much it. So with that, everyone, those were our thoughts. Those were our recommendations. Get Recc'd.